The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound that belonged to the land as much as the cawing of crows or the rustle of dry cornstalks in a November wind. It was the sound of endings and beginnings, of fortunes made and families broken. And on that crisp autumn day in 1971, it was the sound that was hammering the final nail into the coffin of the old Miller place. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket, the fabric stiff with the memory of grease and honest dirt. My name is Arthur Jensen, and I was there to buy back a piece of my own history. The Miller farm wasn't just any parcel of land. It bordered the quarter section my grandfather had homesteaded and my father had farmed until his heart gave out 10 years prior. The Millers had been good neighbors, but old man Miller had passed, and his kids, scattered to the cities, wanted nothing to do with the back-breaking life of turning soil. They'd let it go, and the bank, with its cold, impartial arithmetic, had taken it. Now it was being sold on the courthouse steps. 240 acres of what had once been prime Iowa black dirt. Now it was a mess. Fences were down, the last 50 acres of the back pasture were choked with sumac and buckthorn saplings, and the barn sagged like an old man with a bad back. The crowd was mostly looky-loos, but a few serious bidders were clustered near the front. And right in the center of them, holding court like a king, was Richard Abernathy. Dick Abernathy was everything I wasn't. He farmed 3 sections already, all of it leveraged to the hilt. He drove a brand new Ford F-250 that was washed weekly, and his boots, even standing here on the dusty courthouse lawn, were clean. He was talking to Mr. Henderson from the bank, laughing a little too loud, slapping him on the back. He was the new breed of farmer, the kind who talked about cash flow and depreciation schedules more than rainfall and soil health. He saw land as a line on a balance sheet. I saw it as a trust. The bidding started. It climbed fast, Abernathy driving it up with confident, dismissive waves of his hand. He wanted the Miller place to complete his contiguous block of land. It made sense on a map. It made sense to the banker. The other serious bidders, local men who farmed with paid-for equipment like I did, dropped out one by one, shaking their heads and muttering about the price. Soon it was just Abernathy and me. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Peters, who could sell a screen door to a submarine, turned his attention to me at the back. $210 an acre. I have from Mr. Abernathy, 210. Do I hear 212? 212 from the man in the back. Arthur. A murmur went through the crowd. Art Jensen. What was he doing? He'd been working the home quarter by himself, running his dad's old Farmel M and a John Deere 4020 he'd bought with cash after a good year. Everyone knew he was solvent, but nobody thought he had this kind of money. Not for a piece of land, this rundown. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. 212 it is. Now 215, Mr. Abernathy? Peters's head snapped back to the front. Abernathy didn't even look at me. He just smirked, a little twitch at the corner of his mouth, and raised a finger. 215. We went back and forth like that. 217, 220, 222. The numbers got bigger and the air got tighter. The crowd was dead silent now, watching the drama unfold. Abernathy, the titan of debt-fueled expansion, against me, the quiet man who still believed in the old ways. With every nod I gave, I could feel his irritation growing. This wasn't supposed to be a fight. It was supposed to be a coronation for him. At $230 an acre, he finally turned around. His eyes scanned over me, taking in my patched jacket, my worn-out boots. He didn't see a competitor. He saw a nuisance, a ghost from a bygone era of farming. He turned back to the auctioneer. 235, he said, his voice loud and clear, meant to be the final word. The price was getting foolish, even for land as good as this could be. Mr. Henderson, the banker, put a hand on Abernathy's shoulder, a gesture of support. It was their world. They understood the language of loans and leverage. I was speaking a dialect they'd forgotten. Peters looked at me, his eyebrows raised. 235 is the bid. Selling it all today, folks? No reserve. Arthur, what do you say? Last call. I took my hands out of my pockets. I thought of my father, his hands calloused and cracked, his face lined by sun and worry. I thought of the promise I'd made to him, that I'd never let a banker own me. I had the money. Every last cent was saved from 10 years of scrimping, of rebuilding carburetors myself instead of buying new, of patching tires by hand, of eating simple and living lean. It was all in a cashier's check tucked into my shirt pocket. I looked past Abernathy, past the auctioneer, and stared at the courthouse flagpole, the stars and stripes snapping in the breeze. I gave one last firm nod. 236, I said, my voice steady. Abernathy snorted in disgust. He threw his hands up in a theatrical gesture. Let the fool have it, he announced to the crowd. Hope you like eating dirt, Jensen. That's about all that ground will grow for the next 5 years. A few of his friends chuckled. Mr. Henderson shook his head with a look of pity. Sold. Peters's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. For $236 an acre to Mr. Arthur Jensen. As the crowd broke up and I went to sign the papers and hand over the check that represented a decade of my life, Abernathy walked past me. You'll be back here in 2 years, he sneered, his voice low, selling that junk heap and the home place right along with it. The bank always gets paid, Jensen. You should have remembered that. I didn't say a word. I just signed the papers, my hand steady. I didn't need a loan. I didn't need a banker's approval. I owned it, free and clear. The work was just beginning. A week later, a lowboy trailer rumbled down the gravel road leading to my new derelict farm. On its deck sat the heart of my plan. It wasn't a shiny new tractor. It was a 1958 Caterpillar D6 crawler, a 10-ton beast of yellow iron I'd bought from a retiring road contractor. Its paint was faded and chipped, showing patches of surface rust. A steady drip of hydraulic fluid fell from one of the blade cylinders, leaving a dark spot on the trailer bed. A few neighbors, the ones who farmed on either side of my new property, stopped their pickups on the road to watch. They leaned against their doors, arms crossed, silent judgment in their eyes. They saw a relic, an antique. They saw a man clinging to the past. I saw the tool of my salvation. Unchaining that Dozer felt like unshackling a sleeping giant. I climbed up onto the steel tracks, the metal cold through the seat of my jeans, and settled into the worn operator's seat. There was no cab, no radio, no air conditioning. Just a series of long, greasy levers and a pair of foot pedals polished smooth by decades of work. This was a machine you didn't just operate, you wrestled with it. Before we get into the sweat and grease of the next few years, I've got a question for all of you watching. Have you ever had a piece of old iron, a machine that everyone else called junk, that you trusted more than anything new? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A tractor, a truck, maybe just an old chainsaw. I read every single one. To start the D6, you first had to start its pony motor, a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine bolted to the side of the massive diesel block. I turned the petcocks, pulled the choke, and gave the rope a hard yank. The little engine sputtered, coughed a puff of blue smoke, and then settled into a frantic, high-pitched roar. After letting it warm up for a minute, I engaged the pinion gear, a loud clang echoing across the quiet fields. Then came the moment of truth. I pulled the compression release on the big diesel and engaged the pony motor's clutch. The whole machine shuddered as the tiny engine strained to turn over the 6 massive pistons of the diesel. The sound was a rhythmic, chuffing groan. Chuff, chuff, chuff. I pushed the compression release back in. The groaning deepened, the strain immense. Chuff, chuff. And then, with a volcanic eruption of black smoke from the short, straight exhaust pipe, the diesel caught. The frantic buzz of the pony motor was swallowed by a deep, earth-shaking rumble, a low, powerful, lazy idle that vibrated right through the soles of my boots and into my bones. It was the sound of pure, uncompromising torque. I let it warm up, the smoke turning from black to a hazy grey, and then, with a delicate touch on the levers, I walked the 10-ton machine off the trailer and onto the soil I now owned. The ground trembled as the steel tracks took their first bite. The neighbors just shook their heads and drove away. The fool and his museum piece were home. The first order of business was the back 50. It wasn't a pasture anymore, it was a young forest. Sumac grew in dense thickets, some of them 10 feet tall. Buckthorn and wild plum had taken over, their thorny branches creating an impassable wall. A regular farm tractor would be useless back there. But the D6 wasn't a regular farm tractor. For the next 2 months, from the first hint of dawn until the last ray of light faded from the sky, that back 50 was my world. The work was brutal, a constant battle of man and machine against nature's stubborn reclamation. I'd drop the 8-foot blade just enough to get under the root balls, push the throttle lever forward, and listen to the big diesel engine deepen its roar as it took the load. The dozer would lurch forward, tracks digging in, and a 10-foot sapling would shudder, lean, and then surrender with the sickening sound of tearing roots. I'd push the whole mess, tree, dirt, roots and all, into a massive pile that would later become a bonfire visible for miles. It was a symphony of mechanical violence. The high-pitched squeal of the tracks turning, the deep-throated growl of the engine, the sharp crack of a tree trunk giving way, and the constant grating scrape of the steel blade on rock and dirt. Dust was a constant companion. It coated my skin, filled my lungs, and turned my sweat into muddy streaks. At the end of each day, I was too tired to cook a proper meal. I'd open a can of beans, eat them cold, and fall into my bunk in the old farmhouse, my ears still ringing with the engine's roar. The community watched me with a mixture of pity and scorn. Abernathy would sometimes slow his shiny pickup truck on the county road that ran past the field. He wouldn't wave. He'd just stop for a minute, a smug look on his face, watching the old yellow machine belch smoke as it wrestled with the overgrown land. He was probably calculating how much money I was losing, how much faster his new John Deere 4430 with a V-ripper could have done the job. He wasn't wrong about the speed, but he was wrong about the cost. His speed was bought with banknotes and interest payments. My slowness was bought with my own sweat, and it came with no strings attached. One afternoon in late spring, as I was clearing the last section, it happened. I was pushing a particularly stubborn cluster of wild plum trees when I heard a loud pop, followed by the high-pitched whine of hydraulic fluid spraying under pressure. The blade, which had been biting hard into the earth, suddenly went limp and dropped. I pulled the machine back and shut it down. The sudden silence was deafening. I climbed down and saw the problem immediately. A hydraulic line, brittle with age, had ruptured right at the fitting on the main lift cylinder. A shimmering pool of hydraulic oil was already spreading across the dirt, the lifeblood of the machine bleeding out onto the ground I was trying to heal. At the co-op in town, the talk stopped when I walked in. I was covered head to toe in a film of greasy dust, my hands black with oil. I needed a new high-pressure hose, a few gallons of hydraulic fluid, and some fittings. Old man Hemlock, who ran the parts counter, had to look it up in a dusty catalogue from a decade ago. "A D6, huh?" he grumbled, wiping his hands on an already black rag. "Haven't ordered parts for one of those in years. Gonna have to come from the warehouse in Des Moines. Take you 3 days." As I waited, a couple of farmers who were friendly with Abernathy started talking, just loud enough for me to hear. "C. Jensen's broke down again," one said, "trying to clear that jungle with a piece of junk. Should have just hired Abernathy to do it. Would have been done in a week." "Yeah, but that would cost money," the other snickered. "And we all know how art feels about spending money." I didn't rise to the bait. I just paid for my parts, nodded at Hemlock, and walked out. For 3 days, the D6 sat silent in the field, a wounded yellow giant. I spent the time mending fences by hand, digging post holes with a manual auger until my shoulders screamed. The silence from the field was a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Every piece of my operation was old, every piece was a potential failure point, and I was the only mechanic. When the part finally came in, I worked by the light of a single kerosene lantern hanging from a tree branch. Wrestling with the thick, stiff hydraulic hose was a nightmare. The fittings were frozen with rust and grime. I had to use a 3-foot breaker bar, my feet braced against the track frame, every muscle in my back and shoulders straining just to crack them loose. Hot, gritty hydraulic fluid ran down my arms. Finally, after hours of cursing and scraped knuckles, the new hose was on. I refilled the fluid, started the machine, and when the blade lifted off the ground, smooth and strong, I felt a surge of triumph that was worth more than any crop price. I had faced a breakdown, and I had won. I hadn't called a mechanic. I hadn't paid for a service call. I had relied on myself. That, I knew, was a currency Abernathy didn't understand. By the time the 1973 planting season rolled around, I had reclaimed 40 acres of that back pasture. I had plowed it, dissed it, and planted it to soybeans. It was rough ground, but it was clean. My little plot of beans looked meager next to the vast manicured seas of corn and beans on Abernathy's land, all planted with his brand-new International Harvester 12-row planter. But my 40 acres were mine. They owed nothing to any man in a suit. Then something happened that no one in our small Iowa county could have predicted. The world changed. We started hearing whispers of a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union. At first, it was just talk at the grain elevator. Then it was on the evening news. The Russians were buying American grain, millions and millions of tons of it. They called it the Great Grain Robbery because the government subsidized it and the Soviets got it cheap. But for us farmers, it was a tidal wave of cash. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1.25 a bushel for years, shot up to $2, then $2.50, then over $3. Soybeans went from $3 to $6, then $8, then peaked at an unbelievable $12 a bushel. An intoxicating madness swept through the heartland. Every farmer, for the first time in a generation, was flush with cash. The mood at the co-op changed from cautious grumbling to giddy optimism. That fall, when I sold the soybeans from my reclaimed 40 acres, the check I received was more than I had dared to dream. It was a good feeling, a validation of the back-breaking work, but I knew better than to think it would last. My father had always said, good times never last, and bad times always come back. So I took the money and did what I always did. I paid my property taxes a year in advance. I bought my seed and fertilizer for the next season and paid for it in cash, locking in the price before inflation could eat it away. I put a new steel roof on the sagging barn, doing the work myself with the help of one old neighbor. The rest of the money, a substantial sum, went into a savings account at the bank, earning a modest but safe interest. Abernathy, however, saw the boom not as a cushion, but as a launch pad. He was the golden boy, the man who had been right all along. He strode into the bank, not as a borrower, but as a conquering hero. Mr. Henderson, the banker, treated him like royalty. With land values soaring, Abernathy's net worth on paper had exploded. He used that new equity as collateral for even bigger loans. He bought the 160-acre farm on the other side of the old Miller place, paying a premium price that made the old-timers gasp. He didn't just buy a new tractor, he traded in his entire line of perfectly good 2- and 3-year-old equipment. A brand new John Deere 4630 with a SoundGuard cab that was quieter than a city library became his flagship. He bought a new Gleaner combine, the biggest one they made. He tore down his old machine shed and put up a massive steel Butler building. He installed a new grain drying system with towering silver bins that gleamed in the sun, a monument to his success and his debt. His wife started driving a new Chrysler station wagon with fake wood paneling on the sides. They took a vacation to Hawaii. His name was in the paper for being one of the top producers in the state. To everyone in the county, Richard Abernathy was the embodiment of the successful modern farmer. He was smart, aggressive, and he was winning. And I was seen as a fool, a failure, even in the midst of the biggest boom in agricultural history. The talk at the diner was merciless. Can you imagine, they'd say over coffee, Art Jensen's sitting on a gold mine and he's still running that old junk. If he'd just borrow a little, buy some decent equipment, he could be a millionaire. My discipline was seen as cowardice. My self-reliance was seen as eccentricity. In a world drunk on the cheap champagne of easy credit and high commodity prices, my sobriety looked like sickness. I kept to my routine. Every winter, I'd bring the D6 into the barn and give it a full service. I'd clear another 10 or 15 acres of brush. I overhauled the engine on my Farmall M myself, replacing the sleeves and pistons, grinding the valves, feeling the satisfaction of bringing an old engine back to perfect running order with my own hands. I was building my farm slowly, acre by acre, paying as I went. I was building it on a foundation of rock. Abernathy was building his on a foundation of sand, but at the time his looked like a castle and mine looked like a hovel. One afternoon, I was at the parts store when Mr. Henderson, the banker, came in. He clapped me on the shoulder with a pitying smile. "Arthur," he said, his voice full of false concern, "the economy's booming. Inflation is running hot, but that's good for people holding assets like land. You know, with the price of your farm now, you could borrow enough to really set yourself up right. A new tractor, a bigger planter. You're working too hard. I'm doing all right, Mr. Henderson, I said quietly. Don't be so stubborn, he said, shaking his head. Opportunity is knocking. Dick Abernathy, now there's a man who knows how to answer the door. You should take a page from his book. I just nodded and paid for my gasket set. As I left, I overheard the parts man, old Hemlock, talking to another farmer. The government just raised the prime interest rate another 0.5 point, he said, his voice a low grumble, trying to cool down this inflation. The other farmer shrugged. What's another 0.5 point when corn's at $3? But I felt a chill run down my spine. I stopped by to see my old neighbor, a man named George, who was in his 80s and had seen it all. He was sitting on his porch, watching the sky. I told him what the banker had said, what I'd heard about the interest rates. George didn't look at me, he just kept his eyes on the horizon. I've seen this before, Art, he said, his voice raspy with age. I saw it in the 20s. Everybody's getting rich, the bankers are your best friend, and the credit is flowing like a river in springtime. But trees don't grow to the sky. And when the bankers start smiling that wide and calling you by your first name, you better hold on to your wallet with both hands. Winter is coming, son, it always does. The good times, as my father had known they would, began to fray at the edges. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper of dust on a hot summer wind. The spring of 1979 had been deceptively kind, but by June the sky turned a hard metallic blue, and the clouds that drifted over were thin and useless. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the day as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The soybeans in my reclaimed fields were tough, their deep taproots finding moisture where others couldn't, but even they were suffering. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the land, shimmering off the asphalt roads in waves. At the diner, the talk of Hawaiian vacations and new pickups was replaced by anxious glances at the 5-day forecast and low murmurs about the subsoil moisture levels. The easy confidence that had filled the county for half a decade began to evaporate like a morning dew. For Richard Abernathy, the first real sign of trouble came not from the sky, but from deep within the guts of his prized tractor. I was cultivating my corn with the old Farmall M, sitting out in the open air, feeling the sun on my neck, listening to the familiar steady pop-pop-pop of the engine. Across the fence line, Abernathy was doing the same in his own vast field, but he was doing it in air-conditioned comfort inside the silent cab of his John Deere 4630. It was a magnificent machine, a rolling fortress of green and yellow steel. Then, in the middle of a pass, it just stopped. I watched as he tried to restart it. I couldn't hear the engine over my own, but I saw the puff of black smoke from its exhaust. Then nothing. He tried again. Nothing. After a few minutes, the door to the Soundguard cab swung open and he climbed down, a look of pure bewilderment on his face. He walked around the tractor, kicking at the massive rear tires as if that would fix it. He opened a side panel and stared into a dense maze of wiring and hydraulic lines, a world away from the simple mechanics of my M. He spent an hour out there in the blistering sun before giving up and walking the long half-mile back to his house to call for service. The next day, a shiny white service truck from the John Deere dealership arrived. 2 young mechanics in clean uniforms spent the entire afternoon with diagnostic equipment and manuals, their heads disappearing into the engine compartment. I saw them shaking their heads, making calls on their 2-way radio. By evening, they had loaded a small black-finned box onto their truck and driven away. The mighty 4630 sat abandoned in the field, a silent, useless monument. The talk at the co-op was that it was the electronic fuel injection pump controller, a brand new part, a marvel of modern engineering. And it was fried. A replacement had to be ordered from the regional depot in Moline. It would take a week and cost, as old man Hemlock at the parts counter gleefully told everyone, north of $2,000 plus labor. For that week, Abernathy's most important field sat half-cultivated, the weeds on the untouched side taking advantage of the respite, sucking precious moisture from the soil. He had another tractor, of course, but it was busy on another farm. His whole operation was built on a tight schedule of maximum efficiency, and this one breakdown threw the entire intricate dance into chaos. He had traded resilience for efficiency, and the price was now coming due. Meanwhile, a different kind of news was trickling out of the radio, reports from Washington and Moscow. Something about Afghanistan, something about an embargo. President Carter, in a move of geopolitical protest, had halted all grain sales to the Soviet Union. The great grain robbery was over. The single biggest customer for American corn and wheat was, with the stroke of a pen, gone. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The price on the board at the grain elevator, which had been a source of joy for so long, became an instrument of torture. Corn dropped 20 cents a bushel overnight, then 30 more. Soybeans tumbled from their lofty heights. The tidal wave of cash that had lifted all boats receded, leaving countless farmers stranded on a beach of debt. The first cracks in Abernathy's empire began to show. The new grain bins he'd erected stood half empty. He'd been holding his grain, gambling on the price going even higher. It was a gamble he had now lost spectacularly. The payments on those bins, on the new combine, on the 4630, on the land he'd bought at the peak of the market, were all calculated on $3 corn. With corn now struggling to stay above $2, his balance sheet was bleeding red ink. The banker, Mr. Henderson, started driving his Buick out to Abernathy's farm more often. I'd see the car parked in the driveway, and their conversations weren't the back-slapping, laughing affairs they used to be. They were tense, quiet meetings held by the side of a pickup truck, with Henderson gesturing emphatically with his pen and Abernathy staring at the gravel, his jaw tight. The easy credit that had fueled the boom was turning into a merciless master. The fool and his museum piece, as they had called me, were still working. My old D6, after another winter of clearing brush, had reclaimed the last of the back 50. My Farmel M never missed a beat. My costs were fuel, oil, and my own sweat. I wasn't getting rich, but the ground beneath my feet was solid. The drought broke in late August, with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what little crop there was. But the real storm, the economic one, was just beginning. In Washington, a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve declared war on inflation. He began to raise interest rates, not by a little, but by a lot. The prime rate, the number that governed everything, began to climb like a rocket. 8%, 10, 12. It kept going, a relentless, terrifying ascent. For farmers like Abernathy, who had financed their expansion on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The friendly terms from Mr. Henderson, which had seemed so reasonable when money was cheap, now became a weapon aimed directly at their hearts. An operating loan taken out at 9% was suddenly being renewed at 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. It was like trying to run a marathon with a man on your back who got heavier with every step. The winter of 1981 was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual optimism of planning for the next season was gone, replaced by a cold, pervasive dread. The lights in the coffee shop were dimmer. The laughter was gone. Men who had been proud pillars of the community now looked haunted, their faces etched with a worry that went bone deep. The weekly paper started carrying a new section, notices of foreclosure. At first, it was just a name or two from the edge of the county, farmers who were known to be overextended. Then the names got closer. People we knew, people we saw in church. The social fabric of our community, woven over generations, began to unravel. Families who had farmed the same ground since the Homestead Act were being forced out. For sale signs, hand-painted and crude, sprouted along the gravel roads like a strange new crop. The auctions started up again, but these weren't the optimistic auctions of the early 70s. They were somber, desperate affairs, held in windswept farmyards under grey skies. The crowds were quiet, their faces grim. They were there to watch their neighbours' lives be dismantled, piece by piece, and to wonder whose turn would be next. They were called penny auctions, because corporate buyers and investors were snapping up land and equipment for a fraction of its worth. One frigid day in March, I saw the notice in the paper. It was a full-page ad from the bank. The assets of Abernathy Farms, Incorporated, were to be sold at public auction. All 4 sections of land, the house, the Butler Building, the gleaming grain bins, the full line of late-model John Deere and Gleaner equipment. Everything. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood. The crowd was huge, bigger than for any auction I'd ever seen. They came from 3 counties around, but this time the local farmers weren't the bidders. They were the spectators, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound fear. The real bidders were men in suits, representatives from insurance companies and out-of-state investment firms, men who saw the land not as a living trust, but as a number in a portfolio. I saw Richard Abernathy standing near the machine shed he had built with such pride. He looked like a stranger. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out emptiness in his eyes. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked 10 years older. His wife stood beside him, her face pale, holding his arm as if to keep him from collapsing. Mr. Henderson, the banker, was there too, but he stayed in the background, his face a mask of professional neutrality, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The auctioneer started with the equipment line. The magnificent 4630, the tractor that had been the symbol of Abernathy's success, was first. It was clean, polished to a high shine, but it felt like a funeral. The bidding was sluggish. In a healthy economy, it would have brought a fortune. Now, with no farmers having any cash or credit, the only buyers were the dealers and liquidators. It sold for less than half of what Abernathy still owed on it. I watched his face as the gavel fell. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor, as if he'd been struck. One by one, his machines were sold off, the tools of his ambition scattered to the winds for pennies on the dollar. Then came the land. They sold it in parcels. The first to go was the 160-acre piece he'd bought at the peak of the boom. A man with a briefcase from a Des Moines insurance company bought it without blinking. Then they came to the old Miller place, the 240 acres that bordered my farm, the very land that had started this whole saga a decade earlier. The bidding started low. The men in suits were patient. They knew they were the only ones with money. I stood at the back of the crowd, just as I had all those years ago. I thought of Abernathy's sneer. "You'll be back here in 2 years," he had said. He had been wrong about the man, but right about the place. We were back. When the bidding stalled, I stepped forward. "I'll bid on the 80 acres bordering my property line," I said, my voice clear and steady. There was a murmur. The auctioneer conferred with the banker. Henderson gave a curt nod. They would make more money selling it piecemeal. The man from the insurance company looked at me, annoyed at this local farmer getting in the way. We bid back and forth, but my heart wasn't pounding this time. I wasn't bidding with the last of my savings. I was bidding from a position of strength. I knew what the land was worth to me, and I had the cash, saved and safe in the bank. I bought the 80 acres, free and clear. It made my holding a solid block, reuniting a piece of the old Miller farm with my own. After the sale was over and the crowd began to disperse, leaving the Abernathy family alone in the wreckage of their life, I walked over to Richard. He was staring at the ground, his wife crying softly beside him. He looked up as I approached, his eyes full of a weary shame. He expected me to gloat, to deliver the final cutting remark. "Richard," I said quietly. He just shook his head, unable to speak. "I start planting in 3 weeks," I said. "It's more land than I can handle by myself now. I'll need a hand. The pay isn't great, but it's honest work, if you want it." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand. Disbelief, then confusion, then a flicker of something else washed over his face. He looked at his wife, then back at me. He swallowed hard, his pride fighting a losing battle with the crushing weight of his reality. He gave a single jerky nod. "I'll be there," he whispered, his voice cracking. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. Richard Abernathy came to work for me. It was a difficult adjustment for him. He went from being the master of a 4-section empire to taking orders from the man he had once mocked. He went from driving a computerized tractor in an air-conditioned cab to running my old John Deere 4020, open to the sun and the dust. But slowly a change came over him. Away from the pressures of the banknotes and the commodity markets, he started to remember what it was to simply farm, to feel the soil in his hands, to watch the sky, to know the satisfaction of a straight furrow. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, and he knew the land. I taught him how to maintain the old equipment, how to listen to an engine and know what it needed, how to weld a broken part instead of buying a new one. He taught me a few things about new hybrid seeds and more efficient crop rotation. We never became close friends, but a quiet, profound respect grew between us in the shared work of turning the soil. The community changed too. The flash and swagger of the 70s were gone, replaced by a more sober, more cautious way of life. My neighbors, the ones who had survived, started stopping by, not to mock, but to ask for help. Could I weld a cracked loader bucket? Could I help them figure out why their old tractor wouldn't start? They saw that my stubbornness had been foresight. My eccentricity had been wisdom. I never lorded it over them. We were all just survivors, bound by a shared love for a difficult life. I never got rich, but my farm grew. I bought another parcel of land during the downturn, paying cash. My operation was solid, efficient, and completely my own. Richard worked for me for 5 years, until he and his wife had saved enough to put a down payment on a small farmstead a county over, a place they could manage without a mountain of debt. The last time I saw him, he shook my hand and looked me in the eye. "Thank you, Arthur," he said. "You taught me the difference between the price of a thing and its value." Years later, my son David came home from agricultural college, his head full of ideas about GPS guidance and futures markets. He was a good boy, smart and ambitious, and he looked at my old equipment with a familiar, impatient pity. One Saturday afternoon, he found me in the barn, turning a wrench on the engine of the old D6 crawler. It was grease-stained, and its yellow paint was almost gone, but it still ran as strong as the day I bought it. "Dad," he said, holding up a glossy brochure for a new Case IH tractor. "Look at this. 0% financing for 3 years. We could trade in all this old junk and triple our efficiency." I stopped my work and wiped my greasy hands on a rag. I looked at my son, and I saw myself 30 years ago, and I saw Richard Abernathy. I saw the eternal temptation of the easy promise. I walked him out of the barn, and we stood looking out over the fields, green and healthy under a gentle spring sun. The land was healed, the fences were straight, the farm was whole. "David," I said, putting a hand on his shoulder, "I want you to understand something. That tractor in the brochure is a fine machine, but its engine runs on diesel and its purchase runs on a promise you make to a banker. And a banker's promise can change with the weather in Washington." I pointed to the old D6 sitting in the barn. "That old machine," I said, "it runs on diesel too, but I own it. It doesn't own me. We survived the worst farm crisis in a generation not because we were smart about markets, but because we were disciplined about debt. We relied on our own 2 hands, on iron we could fix ourselves, and on the one thing that never goes into foreclosure: patience." He was quiet for a long time, looking at the land his grandfather had homesteaded, the land I had fought for and healed. He looked at the massive steel Butler building and gleaming grain bins on the horizon, the ones that had belonged to Richard Abernathy, now owned by an investment company in Chicago that leased the land to a corporate megafarm. "The land," I told him, my voice low, "doesn't care if your tractor is red or green or yellow. It doesn't care about your cash flow projections. It only feels the touch of the steel and the shadow of the man driving it. Never let a piece of paper in a banker's file have more power over your life than the calluses on your own hands. That's the only legacy that matters." He nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He looked from the distant corporate farm back to our own, and for the first time I think he truly saw the difference. He saw the value. I went back into the barn, back to the old yellow beast that had been my partner and my salvation. I climbed into the worn steel seat, fired up the pony motor, and soon the whole barn was vibrating with that deep, familiar, earth-shaking rumble. It was the sound of independence. It was the sound of a promise kept. It was the sound of home.